Shalom, I am Rabbi Robbie Harris. Welcome you to the second videocast on the subject of Shabbat from here to eternity. Now, while the subject for today is mountains hanging by a thread, Shabbat in Talmud and Midrash, we do have a little bit of leftover business from last week's videocast. And actually, we have so much leftover business from last week's session that we could do another several sessions only on Shabbat in the Bible. In any case, I'm going to make an executive decision and continue just a little further down the road of Shabbat in the Bible and not in the Bible, because otherwise we really won't be able to proceed into the world of the rabbis and their imagination of a rabbinic Shabbat that was an outgrowth of the biblical Shabbat. So let's go back right to the Bible, a text that we looked at, or at least discussed last time, Exodus chapter 16, and the story of the manna. Now in verse 29, God said one of his first messages about the Shabbat to the children of Israel in the wilderness. The verse goes, "Mark that the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you 2 days' food on the 6th day. Let everyone remain where he is." Today, of course, we would say where he or she is. "Let no one leave her place on the 7th day." Now, what I seem to recall, if my memory is serving me correctly, that we mentioned last week about the 2 loaves of manna, or the 2 portions of manna, being represented on our Shabbat table today in the 2 chalot. So that every Friday evening we re-evoke for ourselves the miracle of the manna in the wilderness. What I'd like to focus on right now is the second portion of that verse. Al yetzei ish mimkomo bayom ha-shvi'i. Let no one go out from his or her place on the 7th day. The question is, what does the word place mean? Does it mean house or community, tent? What does it mean to be shut in one's community? Let's pay attention that the Bible does not define the word place. When the Torah says the word makom, it presumably would leave it open to interpretation, both in its own historical context. What did the Israelites say, in the 9th century, in the 8th century, in the 7th century BCE about the word place, and how did they practice it? It's not exactly clear to us. When the rabbis come to the word place, they're pretty clear. They don't want us to be mobile on Shabbat. They don't want us to be traveling from settlement to settlement, to community. They want us to hang around the homestead, as it were. And they created what we'll see later on in our course, what was a Tchum Shabbat, a limit of how far one could legitimately travel before one would transgress this verse. They also looked at this word yetzei, which in the Bible clearly means let no one leave. And they did a creative reading, as they want to do in the Midrash, and they'll say not al yetzei, but al yotzi. Let no person bring forth from his place, from his private place, into the public domain. And this began, this was the root, I should say, of many of the practices of the rabbinic Jewish Shabbat, of not carrying. And if you needed to carry, you only could carry in an eruv, a term that means, kind of an artificial demarcation of public versus private domain. And again, later on in the course, we'll talk about eruv. So this is one of the key verses that in the Bible, we should say, is a bit unclear. It seems clear enough in its general principle. People should hang around the home, but it doesn't get into specifics. I'd like to look at another verse with you, and that is Exodus chapter 31, verses 15 through 17. Now, the second and the third of those 2 verses are verses that we recognize from the Siddur and the Shabbat afternoon Kiddush. If I were to say, V'shamru v'nei Yisrael ta-Shabbat, lasot et ha-Shabbat l'do'otam brit olam, or sing it, V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, I'm sure that many of us would remember it. What I'd like to do is look at these 2 verses with the verse that comes immediately before that verse. Sheshit yamim yeyaseh melacha, uvayom hashvi'i Shabbat Shabbaton Kodesh Ladonai, kol ha'oseh melacha biyom HaShabbat mot yumat. That was verse 17. 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. And then the two verses that we know from Kiddush in Shabbat afternoon. The Israelite people shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as a covenant for all time. It shall be a sign for all time between me and the people of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he ceased from work and was refreshed, or whatever the word vayinafash meant. Now this first verse, on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death, sounds very forbidding. Let's be frank. None of us want some legal authority or a court to start putting people to death, God forbid, for non-compliance with Shabbat prohibitions. We should relax about it. Nobody's doing that today. They haven't done that for a very, very long time. In fact, we have only one story in the Bible about somebody violating Shabbat and being put to death. And let's say the rabbis don't really make a practice of that when they get to handling that material in the Talmud and Midrash. But what I'm interested in is not the forbidding end of that first verse. I want us to take a look at the word milacha. It says, 6 days may milacha, may quote-unquote work or labor be done. Now when we get farther along in our course, we'll see that this word milacha doesn't mean, just any old kind of work. It's a very, very specific kind of work. I'll anticipate a little bit what we'll see in a couple weeks, although it's never defined in the Bible. Some people say this is work that demonstrates human superiority over nature. So it means like building, writing, lighting a fire, things like that. But it doesn't mean, let's say, picking up this table and schlepping it from one side of the room to the other. If you have guests coming in on Shabbat, and you realize that, unexpected guests, I should say, and you need to add a table to your table, and the tables are heavy, and you move them from one room to another, that's not work. In other words, it might be plenty of work. Plenty of people moving around furniture will find that it's work. But it's not the kind of work that this verse forbids. So I want us to make a mental note to look at this word milacha. You can do it at home as you're reading your Bibles and see that the Bible itself, the Torah, does not define the term milacha. That's left for rabbinic interpretation. That will become key in the weeks ahead as we study Shabbat in Talmud and Midrash. Another verse that is pretty close to the previous two, it also comes from the book of Exodus, is chapter 35, verse 3. Lo tiva'aru esh b'chol moshvotechem b'yom HaShabbat. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day. Now this seems obvious. Wow, Jews don't make fires on the Sabbath. And the Israelite people apparently in the days of the Torah also did not. Absolutely no disagreement there. The question that the rabbis will later face, and therefore we will all continue to face, is what if the fire is already burning before Shabbat? Can you enjoy it onto Shabbat? Can you keep your houses light and warm and your food warm on Shabbat with a fire that was made before the Shabbat begins? Now, if you look very, very clearly at the actual meaning of 35 verse 3 in the book of Exodus, and look at its context, you'll see that once again, there's no clear instruction about what the Bible may have in mind. The Torah says, Lo teva'aru esh, you shall kindle no fire. Certainly a legitimate interpretation is, don't kindle fire. Don't have any fire. Don't have any light. Don't have any heat on Shabbat. Keep your Shabbat house dark. And in fact, the medieval Jewish I don't like to call it a schismatic group because who knows who's a sectarian and who's not a sectarian. But the Karaites, a group that we'll probably not really encounter in this course, but the Karaites, in fact, generally interpreted this verse to mean there should be no fire whatsoever. You may not have a well-lit Shabbat household, and you should not have warm food on Shabbat, etc. The rabbis looked at that and said, not so deliberately, but the effect of what they would say is, that can't be. It would be miserable. Shabbat, because we'll see in other verses, should be an enjoyable experience. Let's interpret this verse to meaning, yes, on the Sabbath day you can't kindle any fire, but beforehand you can kindle fire, and as long as it's going, you can feel free to enjoy it into Shabbat. And that's why, as long as that original fire is burning Erev Shabbat, before the Sabbath begins, you can have a lighted house, you can have a warm, heated house, you can keep your food warm if it's already cooked. You're not allowed to cook on Shabbat, but you could mostly cook it before the Sabbath would begin and keep it warm into Shabbat. Any traditional Jewish household had its blech. Of course, if it was a Sephardic household, it didn't call it a blech. It had, a warmer of some sort, an oven that was already stoked and ready to go for the whole Shabbat, and food could be effectively heated up if it were already cooked before the Sabbath would begin. This becomes key. The rabbinic interpretation of this verse becomes key in understanding Shabbat lamps, or as we call them today, Shabbat candles. And we'll find out later in the course that when the rabbis decided that their interpretation of Exodus 35 verse 3 was the correct one to follow, that had profound implications because they wanted everybody to make sure they would demonstrate that they followed rabbinic practice. And they basically ordered people to light fires before Shabbat that would burn into Shabbat. That is the origin of the Shabbat candles. More on that in a couple of sessions. At any rate, that's enough of the Torah. I mentioned in the introduction for today that, gosh, if we continue to examine all of the passages in the Torah to really get a picture of the biblical Shabbat, we would go on for weeks and weeks. In fact, that could be its own separate course. But I'm going to be disciplined and move on to another section. Now, Shabbat is mentioned occasionally in the books of the former prophets, in the narratives of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. But because of my determination to at least get through biblical Shabbat in 2 sessions with you, I'm going to turn to an early prophetic verse coming from the middle of the 8th century BCE. It's the prophet Amos, or Amos as he's sometimes known. So again, as I said last week, I hope you're checking up on these verses. You have your Tanakh in hand, and you can turn me off and turn me on and go look right now at chapter 8 of the book of Amos, verses 4 through 7. Okay, got that book? Okay, I'm assuming that you're all now have had a chance to look at this text. This is a fantastic verse because it combines 2 elements of biblical Israelite religion and later Judaism. Let's read the verse first together, and then we'll do our interpretation. The prophet says to the people, "Listen to this, you who devour the needy, annihilating the poor of the land, saying, if only the new moon were over, so that we could sell grain, the Sabbath, so that we could offer wheat for sale, using an ephah that is too small and a shekel that is too big, tilting a dishonest scale and selling grain refuse as grain. We will buy the poor for silver, the needy for a pair of sandals. The Lord swears by the pride of Jacob, I will never forget any of their doings." So this is a very stern lesson the prophet is drawing. He doesn't want the ritual observance of either the festival of the new moon, Rosh Chodesh as we would call it, which was a much more important festival in the biblical days, or the Shabbat. The prophet doesn't want observance of these, or the ritual observance of these important mitzvot, to in any way countermand the ethical dimension of religion. We're not supposed to be spending, according to the prophet, late in the afternoon on Shabbat, just waiting. I can't wait for Shabbat to end. I can't wait for Shabbat to end so I can open my store again. Now, forget the fact that I can open my store and make an honest living. I don't think the prophet is really talking about that in particular, right? Although we would say, enjoy Shabbat. If you need to open your business or do work on Saturday night, perfectly okay. A person is entitled to follow his or her profession. although you're not supposed to be eager about getting back to it on Saturday afternoon. But what the prophet is saying in this verse is something else. He's condemning somebody who is being ritually meticulous about observing Shabbat in order to cheat in his or her business, beginning as soon as Shabbat would end. And that's a thing altogether different. Take a couple of minutes when we're done here to reread, not just Amos chapter 8, but any of the prophet's teachings. He was really one of the first people to make a big part of his rhetoric that ethical and ritual must go together. If a person observes the biblical commandments according to their ritual specifications and then goes out and cheats his neighbor in business or in any other way, that cannot mean what the Torah has in mind when it urges us to observe Shabbat. What Amos is saying, you're allowed to work, but you have to work honestly. And how much the worse is it is if you're cheating in your business and you're meticulously observing the ritual commandments of Judaism, then it looks to everybody like your religion allows you to be unethical. And that cannot be, says the prophet. Now, for our purposes, in trying to understand not just the moral implications of the prophetic teaching, but to try to get a picture of what was Shabbat like in the Bible, I turn to the words of one of my first teachers in Bible, Shalom Paul, who wrote a wonderful commentary on the book of Amos. He writes as follows: in order to provide decisive incriminating evidence, Amos resorts to a favorite tactic, direct citation of the people's own very own words. From the quotation, one gets a rare glimpse into the religious practice of northern Israel during the mid-8th century. On the new moon and Sabbath, work actually ceased and trade stopped. In their eager desire to continue their corrupt business practices, the businessmen could not wait until these two holidays were over so that they could resume their everyday wheeling and dealing. The indictment is leveled against those who combine strict ritual performance with daily acts of dishonesty. That's taken from Amos, the Hermanoia, critical and historical commentary on the book of Amos. Definitely a bestseller. But at any rate, it's a great, great commentary on the book of Amos. The thing I like to tell people is about the relationship between the ethical and the ritual. Now, by the way, I'm being a rabbi right now, not being a biblical scholar. We should imagine an orange. An orange, we buy an orange, we want to eat an orange, we want to eat what's inside. The peel, although there are all these great recipes for using orange peel, enough of that, we generally throw away. Peel goes in the garbage and we eat the fruit. So when we think of eating an orange, what we really mean is the inside, the fruit. So I could say, well, if the outside is no important, what would happen if you buy an orange? I'm not really interested in the peel. I take the peel off, I throw it away and throw the orange in the refrigerator, waiting so it's really ready to eat. When I want it, I don't have to use the peel, take the peel off then. You'd go back a couple days later and you'd find that the orange is spoiled. It's not good. The peel is what helps preserve that orange. That, as a metaphor, if you don't mind me pushing it, is a great way of understanding the relationship between the ethical and the ritual dimensions of biblical commandments. The ikar, the essence of what the rabbis would say, is what you and I would call ethical monotheism. We want to worship God. We want to have religion help us to be better people, to create a better society, and therefore a better overall world. But it's the ritual mitzvot, things like Shabbat, things like prayer, things like observance of holidays, that help preserve that unique ethical message of Torah. So you need the two together. The prophet is not condemning ritual observance of Shabbat or Rosh Chodesh. Far from it. He just doesn't want people to think that's an end in itself. The really important thing is helping the needy, helping the poor, following your business practices, earning your buck, nothing wrong with that, but remembering that the performance of your profession shouldn't cause anybody else harm. Observe the law, observe the ritual. Okay, another verse. I'm flipping in the Bible to what might be the next chronological mention of a Shabbat in the Bible, Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21 and 22. Now, in fact, the whole of that section in Jeremiah 17 that mentions the Shabbat, scholars are not certain exactly when Jeremiah said this. Was it early in his career? Was it late in his career? He doesn't usually weigh in at great length on ritual observance. So it may well be that this is one of the earliest messages of Jeremiah, perhaps when the King Josiah was still alive, creating his religious reform, found in the Bible in 2 Kings, about chapter 22 or so, if you're scoring at home. But let's take a look at these two verses, Jeremiah 17, 21 and 22. I'm just going to read them in English. Thus said the Lord, guard yourselves for your own sake against carrying burdens on the Sabbath day and bringing them through the gates of Jerusalem. Nor shall you carry out burdens from your houses on the Sabbath day or do any work, but you shall hallow the seventh day as I have commanded your fathers. Now, this is an element of the biblical Shabbat. Again, the Bible doesn't, or the prophet here, doesn't give you details. He's stating a general principle. He doesn't want you to carry burdens. Well, you might say, if you were a rabbi, how far? Or how may you, under certain circumstances, how may you not? Or how ought you not in other circumstances? But we'll leave that for the rabbis. What is the exact or the best guess at the contextual meaning of this verse? I turn to a different modern commentary, that of the scholar Jack Lundbaum in the Anchor Bible on Jeremiah. This is the new Anchor Bible on Jeremiah. He writes as follows. This is Jeremiah's interpretation of the fourth commandment. Now, when he's talking about the 10 commandments, the fourth one, the term 10 commandments is not really a Jewish term, I should tell you, because we have 613 commandments, not just 10. But that's a whole subject for another day. At any rate, Jack Lundblom, thinks that Jeremiah is really looking at the fourth commandment, having a specificity not found either in Exodus chapter 20 or Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, if you went back and looked at the Aseret HaDibrot, the Decalogue, or what others call the Ten Commandments, in those two biblical chapters, and we looked at that last week, you'd find that, again, the Shabbat is presented in the most general terms, and there's very little that is specific about the Torah's expectations for Israel to observe or to remember on the Sabbath day. The how, the wherefore, the whys and wherefores, as Gilbert and Sullivan would put it, that's left to later interpretation. So Jack Lundblom is thinking that what Jeremiah is doing is interpreting. He is interpreting the Aseret HaDibrot, the words of the Ten Commandments about the Sabbath, and giving it some specificity. He writes as follows. The load is generally thought to be produce coming into the city from outlying areas, right? So look back again at the first of these two verses. Thus said the Lord, guard yourselves for your own sake against carrying burdens on the Sabbath day and bringing them through the gates of Jerusalem. That means that certain people, perhaps farmers, perhaps tradesmen who've purchased a produce, want to bring it into Jerusalem, into the big city, to sell, right? And that shouldn't be something that they would do on the seventh day. Now, he's not talking only about the selling, which might be evident from other verses, but against the carrying into, from some domain into another domain. That seems to be what the prophet is forbidding. And then in verse 22, the second of the two verses from Jeremiah, the words, a load from your homes, well, this refers to goods from home brought to be sold in the marketplace. These are also disallowed. So he writes, no garage sales, tag sales, or Sabbath flea markets. Israel is not supposed to be doing any of those things. So to clarify, it's as though the prophet is looking at the Aseret HaDibrot, the overall commandment of concerning the Shabbat, whether found in the version from Deuteronomy, more likely for Jeremiah, or Exodus. In either case, he's saying, what is a specific thing that would be prohibited? What's work, you and I might call it. And one of the things that Jeremiah says, you can't bring things in from the countryside into the settled area, nor may you bring things from your own home, even if you are already in the settled area, in order to sell them on the Sabbath day. Two distinct elements. He's addressing the carrying of burdens. This becomes very, very key. This, you might call it a late 7th century or perhaps early 6th century text, becomes very formative in later biblical Israelite religion under the Persian era in the 6th century, as we'll see, because Jeremiah is one of the first prophets canonized, as it were, after his death. We have very few references to any of the early prophets in the later literature like Chronicles or Ezra and Nehemiah, but in those 3 books dating from the Persian period, they're citing Jeremiah a lot, and they think that he is an authoritative voice of God. Therefore, this prohibition that Jeremiah cites becomes formative for Persian era Judaism. Let's go to a couple of late prophetic texts from the book of Isaiah. After chapter 40 in the book of Isaiah, we're not really thinking anymore about the 8th century Isaiah ben Amos, the one who says, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, the one who sees the angelic revelation of God in Isaiah 6, but an exilic Isaiah, an Isaiah that already refers to Cyrus, the emperor of Persia and the conqueror of Babylonia in the mid to late 6th century BCE. So I'm going to look at 2 verses together with you. The first of those is Isaiah 56, verse 2. Now, if you notice in your Bible, you're turning backwards because Jeremiah is after Isaiah. The Bible is not always presented in strictly chronological order, an observation the rabbis made, years and years ago. But so Isaiah 56, 2. And he's sort of writing about Shabbat. Ashrei enosh ya'aseh zot. Happy is the one who does this, the one who holds fast to it. And what is that thing? He writes, to keep the Sabbath and does not profane it, and stays his hand from doing any evil. Now, here there's a juxtaposition between observing the Shabbat on the one hand and not doing any evil on the other. So this is a general, almost sermon-like comment of the prophet that somebody engaged in Shabbat observance, that person is to be kept from doing evil, or could keep him or herself from doing evil. There again, the prophet echoing what we saw earlier in Amos. The goal of Shabbat is not just to observe Shabbat. In the Bible, we already have the intimations or the declarations that doing Shabbat is supposed to make us better people. We're supposed to, in our observance of Shabbat, is supposed to lead us to be better people. And as the verse says at the end, not do any evil. Now, this sentiment of the prophet, this second or Deutero-Isaiah, comes up again in Isaiah chapter 58, verse 13. And this is a text out of the Haftorah for Yom Kippur morning. So you can find it either in your Machzor or in a Bible. And this is a verse that introduces just one of the most wonderful associations Jews continue to make with Shabbat. I'll read it first in Hebrew. Im tashiv mi Shabbat raglecha asot chafatzecha biyom kodshi v'karata la Shabbat oneg. Right? If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath delight, oneg, the Lord's holy day honored, and if you honor it and go not your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor strike bargains, verse 14, then you can seek the favor of the Lord. So what's the prophet saying here? Again, already in the Bible, we see 2 possible attitudes towards Shabbat observance. It could be, oh my gosh, I have to observe Shabbos. I can't do this. I can't do that. I can't watch TV. I can't answer the phone. Of course, they didn't have TVs and phones back then, but you know that. I can't attend to my affairs and look upon that as a burden. And these biblical voices are saying, no, it's the burdens that you ought not be doing. It's the schlepping in of goods from the countryside to the city side, or schlepping goods out of your homes into the market, right? Or worrying, as the prophet Amos had it, worrying about, oh my gosh, is it almost over? Are there 3 stars out? Can I go and open my shop again? That's not the attitude the prophet wants to convey here. It's the opposite of that. What we should be doing, says the prophet, is calling Shabbat oneg, delight. Now, the word oneg is such a great word. Many of us know the word from our little Friday night conclaves, after Shabbat services. We gather together. It's like a kiddush, we get together. I'll see you at the oneg. Well, that's that word that the prophet uses here. And it means whatever you think delight means. Every person will look at the word oneg and construe its broader meaning for him or herself, and that's exactly what the prophet has in mind. I want to look at Shabbat not as a burden, according to the prophet's words, but rather as a delightful way of spending my time, of freeing myself completely from all of my affairs and not worrying about it, and having that kind of thought and tension just leave my body, leave my mind, so I can just concentrate on family, on friends, on God, on Judaism, on Torah, whatever, walk in the woods, whatever causes you, on good food, whatever causes you to think of the word delight. That's what you should be doing on Shabbat. Let's take a look at one last biblical text. I know it's been a longer session than we planned. And do a wrap-up of this video cast. We're going to be looking at the book of Nehemiah, or Nehemiah, chapter 10, beginning at verse 32, and then another text in Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah and Ezra were Jewish leaders. They were not prophets that came sponsored by the Persian government, Ezra as a kind of a magistrate, and Nehemiah as the governor. Nehemiah was the higher ranked of the two by far. And they came to reestablish the Jewish community, or the Judean community, in Jerusalem in the late 6th or 5th centuries. The dates are somewhat under dispute. Be that as it may, in chapter 10, the people are being charged by the two leaders with pledging themselves to do certain things according to the covenant as the two leaders understand the Torah to command, and one of these points at least has to do with Shabbat. So in verse 32, it reads as follows: "The peoples of the land who bring their wares and all sorts of foodstuff for sale on the Sabbath day, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or holy day." So this is a pledge of the people that are addressed by the prophets, the people who are reading from the Torah and pledging themselves to observe it. There's other people, it's not clear whether they're Judean or not Judean, foreigners or Gentiles, or just Jews that of whom the two leaders disapprove, who are doing precisely what people like Amos and Jeremiah and Isaiah were trying to forbid, namely doing business on the Sabbath. You see, things haven't changed in 3,000 years. The people in chapter 10 are pledging themselves. They're promising to the two leaders that they're not going to buy from them, buy from the people who would bring in their wares on the Sabbath day. We don't know how well they observed their promises, but we know that they made the promises. But then later in the book, chapter 13, beginning at verse 15 of Nehemiah, the governor himself writes that it's the promises were not always kept, or they were observed in the breach. Let's read a couple of the verses. Again, I begin at chapter 13, verse 15. "At that time I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and others bringing heaps of grain and loading them onto asses, also wine, grapes, figs, and all sorts of goods, and bringing them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. I admonished them there and then for selling provisions. Tyrians who lived there brought fish and all sorts of wares and sold them on the Sabbath to the Judahites in Jerusalem. I censured the nobles of Judah, saying to them, 'What evil thing is this that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? This is just what your ancestors did, and for it God brought all this misfortune on this city, and now you give cause for further wrath against Israel by profaning the Sabbath.'" Right? So the story goes on in chapter 13, verses 19 through 22. Nehemiah says, "When shadows filled the gateways of Jerusalem at the approach of the Sabbath, I gave orders that the doors be closed, and ordered them not to be opened until after the Sabbath. I stationed some of my servants at the gates, his policemen as it were, so that no goods should enter on the Sabbath. Once or twice the merchants and the vendors of all sorts of wares spent the night outside of Jerusalem, trying to sneak in, I don't know, whatever they were doing. But I warned them, saying, what do you mean by spending the night alongside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. I'll arrest you. From then on, they did not come on the Sabbath. I gave orders to the Levites to purify themselves and come and guard the gates to preserve the sanctity of the Sabbath. And this is amazing. This shows the very day-to-day struggles of this Persian-appointed Jewish governor of Yahud, of the Judean province of the Persian Empire, trying to get the whole community to observe the Sabbath. And you see there are resourceful people, intrepid people, trying to find ways around the law. They don't want to observe Shabbat. They want to do buying and selling all 7 days of the week. So he tries through censure, through public demonstration, and finally by ordering his police to prevent Shabbat work from going on. There's one aspect here that's very, very important for our future understanding of Shabbat as we finally leave the Bible behind, as it were. Of course, we'll be reading the Bible all throughout the course, but in terms of how the rabbis interpreted it as opposed to what the Bible meant in its own context. And that is verse 18. So I want you to take a look again at Nehemiah 13, verse 18. He writes, this is just what your ancestors did, and for it God brought all this misfortune on the city. So what Nehemiah is saying, it was on account of past Shabbat violations that God caused the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. He raises the stakes with Shabbat. It wasn't idolatry, according to this message of Nehemiah. It wasn't violations of the ethical dimensions of Judaism even. He here somewhat disagreeing with Amos. What he's saying, it was Shabbat observance. This was the key thing for which God brought destruction upon the city. Now, it seems clear to me, at least, as a biblical scholar, that Nehemiah here in chapter 13 is interpreting Jeremiah of chapter 17 that we read earlier. He is saying that since the prophet had raised the stakes in that, you might want to call it sermon or speech on Shabbat, concerning Shabbat that he gave in chapter 17, he's saying the implications of that is clear. We have to observe Shabbat if we don't want further anger of God against our community. Now, the theology of observance and anger and reward and punishment, this is not a theology that we're going to take up right now. It seems to have been the major theology of the Bible, although not the exclusive one. The rabbis have their own problems with it. Heck, that's another course altogether. But the important point here is that Jeremiah is being adduced or cited, as it were, or referred to as one of the key message givers concerning the role of Shabbat and the preservation of the Israelite and Judean community. We would say that Nehemiah, with his admonitions and threats and police actions, was certainly not a liberal-minded individualist. We might not want to have lived next door to him, but he was one of the major players in reestablishing the Jewish community successfully in our ancestral land in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, following the Babylonian exile. What we are seeing in this text, probably around the 5th century BCE, is Nehemiah acting as governor of the Persian province of Yahud, implementing the law, as law, the interpretations of Shabbat injunctions issued by such prophets as Amos, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, whom we haven't looked at, and 2nd Isaiah. Where some Torah legislation on the Sabbath was perhaps too general to be understood as specifically conveying prescriptions and prohibitions of Shabbat, the prophets and secular leaders, such as Nehemiah, sought to concretize their statements into Shabbat law. In this, we'll end our survey of Shabbat in the Bible, and in our next installment of Shabbat from Here to Eternity, we'll begin at last to consider Shabbat in Talmud and Midrash.